You're thinking, what's the new equation? It's about building trust and delivering sustained outcomes that make change for today and tomorrow.
Welcome to our Women in Leadership podcast and vodcast series sponsored by PwC. We're broadcasting today from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm Haley Wooden, Executive Editor of Business in Vancouver, and it's my pleasure to host this 3-episode series. It will feature inspiring female leaders from different backgrounds and sectors on topics that are important to all of us: leadership, mentorship, ESG, and EDI. And across the series, our guests will be in conversation with me and experts from PwC. Episodes run from March 8th to 10th around International Women's Day on March 8th. And today's episode looks at leadership and EDI. Here's our conversation. March 8th, and today's episode takes a look at leadership and EDI. I'm joined by Brooke, a tax partner with PwC Canada, the firm's ESG tax leader, and of particular relevance to our conversation today, PwC Canada's BC Region Inclusion and Diversity Leader. Brooke, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Haley.
And we're very pleased to have Teara Fraser with us. She is the founder and lead executive of Esqueo Air, making her the first Indigenous woman to launch an airline in Canada. Teara is also the founder of the Indigenous Lift Collective and the founder and former leader of the Raven Institute. Welcome, Teara, and thank you so much for joining us for this series.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
I'm sure I could talk to you for hours about your career trajectory and leadership, but maybe to get us started, Teara, I'd love to hear a bit about what experiences, people, places, goals, whatever it may be, have really shaped or influenced your leadership style.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think, right? Really big question, but we're influenced by every moment. We're influenced by every human being, by every conversation, by everything that we learn. And so what's coming to mind as you ask me about that question is I suppose being, first disconnected from my Métis heritage, and then finding my way back to being reconnected is a really big part of who I am, and a proud part of who I am to be that. And I talk about how that connection with relational worldview or an Indigenous worldview, that connection to the earth, each other, something greater, ourselves, is certainly shaped me. I was born in Hay River, Northwest Territories, grew up in a small town, and was a young single mother, and with very little education and very little access to opportunity. When I decided to go on a trip to Africa, that changed everything. And then I decided that the guy flying the airplane had the coolest job ever, and wanted to do that, and made that happen. And that's led to my entrepreneurial journeys, and yeah, I don't know if there's anything more you want to know, but you just ask away.
I would love to follow up on that reconnection or connection piece. I think often employees feel like maybe they can't bring their heritage or their culture or things that are really significant to them to the workplace, and that can be a bit of a balance. Can you talk a bit about the theme of reconnection within the business or workplace context and how you balance that?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about your first question, and probably won't get to the others, but we are whole beings. This dominant worldview that we're all swimming in has us thinking that we have a work self. We don't have a work self. We're one human being. We are a mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, whole, emphasis on whole being. And I think that it is critically important that we reframe our relationship with what belongs in the workplace and what doesn't belong in the workplace, our whole selves. needs to belong everywhere we are. My daughter, who I work alongside at the Raven Institute, she talks about young people, and that her vision of the future is that our young wisdom holders are holding no part of themselves in exile. And that's what we do, or what we think we have to do, or we've been told we have to do, is to leave parts of ourselves in exile in the workplace. And I don't buy that one little bit. And in fact, any workplace that is still subscribing to that doesn't actually understand equity and justice at all. And I'll give you a small example that I think really fits with what you're asking me here. When I started my master's degree at Railroads University, I was there full of all kinds of imposter syndrome, and I don't actually use that anymore. I don't believe in that either. Let that go. Forget that. But at the time, do I belong here? And is this, there's all these smart people here. And we were asked to write on the Post-it note the gift that we brought to the program. And I wanted to write love on the Post-it note. And the environments that I've been taught in told me, this is my own self-talk, that doesn't belong here. People will think that you're not serious, or that you're all floofy and fluffy, and that just wasn't something that belonged there. I never did write love on the Post-it note then, but I try to as often as I can ever since, and say that not only does love belong in leadership, not only does love belong in academia or in the work environment, but if we're not showing up with love or deep care, if you prefer, if we're not showing up with love or deep care, then I don't know that we have any business leading. And if we're not showing up with love and deep care in the work that we're doing in our businesses, then, what are we doing? Does that, I don't know if that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Brooke, I want to come to you now. To what extent are you seeing this kind of reframing the conversations about bringing our whole selves, recognizing that within the office? Are you seeing that in the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely relate to that, Teara, because I think, I went through business school. So, I'm a corporate tax partner. So it's a very structured, you go through university, and I'm going to do this, and there's steps to get there. And I feel that as I was going through that training, it always felt that I was trying to fit in because, being a little bit on the outside, I'm in a minority group as a woman. I do remember like coming into a situation trying to figure out, okay, what are they expecting from me? What are they expecting me to say? And so it was always me changing myself to fit the norm that was there. And what really opened up to me, where I felt more like a leader, that I could bring my own style, is that because I was different, and because I represent, myself and all the different parts of myself, but that could resonate with a lot of different groups, that my difference of opinion and view is what is valuable here, instead of how can I conform to be like everyone else. Actually, I bring a different perspective because of who I am. And and I think that narrative has really come out in the pandemic, to be honest. Like, being a kind of quieter woman, I suppose. I was really inspired by Bonnie Henry, like kind of her leadership throughout the pandemic, and just that care and recognition of how people are feeling. And I would say love, like that you can feel that deep authenticity from her. I think that really resonated with me, in that I didn't have to be this loud, boisterous kind of eloquent speaker, but really being authentic to who you are, showing that you care, showing that you're being authentic, really resonates with, the world today. And I definitely see that changing in greater society, but also in corporations as well.
I think it takes an element of bravery to bring your whole self to work, especially in climates where that maybe hasn't been the case, or maybe that's unfamiliar to colleagues? I see you both nodding. Teara, how can leaders of organizations create a space where colleagues feel comfortable bringing love or talking about love or bringing their whole selves to a workplace?
Well, just I suppose the same in everything else is, giving it some space, amplifying it to say, how do we really honor the whole human that is really, bringing, we spend more time at work than we do anywhere else. So, thinking about how do I really honor this human that we're so blessed that this is where they choose to spend their time and their contribution. And so, so when we see it, how do we celebrate it? Right? How do we bring our own whole selves to the work to show that it's okay to do that, and to talk about feelings, and we have being able to even just practice a check-in that has a 2 words about how you're feeling in this moment, and as a way to open and close in ultra modified ceremony, just to have those connections, to simply ask people, how are you? And the other thing I try and model, which makes people so uncomfortable, is we, in our polite mediocrity, here, especially in Canada, how are you? Good. How are you? Oh, excellent. And sometimes I will actually share how I'm doing. So, and it surprises people and sometimes can make people quite uncomfortable to say, actually, I'm having like a really terrible day, and I'm having a hard day, and people are like, oh my goodness. So that we aren't having to pretend all the time that everything is perfect, because it's not.
No, I mean, I've been guilty of that. I'm sure many listeners have been guilty of that too. Before you even have the time to think about how you are, you just respond with good. But, I think being open and honest can give others permission to do the same too. Creates a conversation that's maybe more honest.
Of course.
Brooke, I'm curious, you mentioned the pandemic in your remarks a little bit earlier. Do you think that the pandemic has caused leaders to maybe be more open to having these check-ins, to discussing mental health and well-being more generally, and to embracing discussions about how we truly are?
Absolutely, because I think that what I've noticed throughout the pandemic is, before you, especially in the workplace, you sort of have these set built-in structures that you didn't really realize that you had before. Like you would commute into the office, and that's actually a nice transition point. And you would have the social, around the coffee room, casual chats, and I didn't really, and micro breaks as well. And I didn't really notice the impact until it was all gone. And so I think that the pandemic really heightened the importance of mental health and wellness. And as because working from home is one thing, but the pandemic on top of that, and the worry of all of the different things that lead into that, makes a big impact on your own health and well-being. So absolutely, I definitely think that leaders having to take care of their teams, and vice versa, just being in it together actually opens up a dialogue as well. Like, nobody had a playbook for what to do. So I think it's a nice leveling point to talk about how things are going for yourself, and just really heightening how that interplays with your team. Mm-hmm. So similar to what you were saying, Teara, like leading by example. And so like the example you set by how you speak in meetings, how you care about each other, I think that creates the culture that really permeates throughout, making it safe to be yourself at work.
And it's interesting. I see like the and with all of these topics of the impact of the pandemic, I see the pandemic requiring us to be more innovative than ever. And then actually being able to break ourselves out of systems that are no longer serving us. And so being able to be more innovative than ever. I see mental health deteriorating so significantly, and also seeing the amplifying of the importance of mental health. And, when it comes to humanity, I mean, I think that on the the COVID has really shaken, I'll speak for myself, shaken my view of humanity. And at the same time, it has actually forced us to see each other as human beings. I was talking on the phone during kind of the height of the pandemic with, somebody very important that would normally be very proper. And, he said, "I'm sorry, but I'm literally hiding in the closet at home from my 3 kids to try and take this call." Right. So it's offered us a space to really allow ourselves to be human, to see the cats and the dogs and the kids and the barking and the, and to be like, that's okay. It's all welcome. And then, from an equity justice lens, this is the privilege pandemic. It has amplified and created even greater gaps and heightened privileges, and certainly aware of many of my own privileges. And so in the one context, that's just uncovered stuff that was already there. It's just made it more visible. But the hope is that in that we can actually sit with it and do something different with it, and create systems that work for everybody.
That's a great point.
You're thinking, what's the new equation? It's about building trust and delivering sustained outcomes that make change for today and tomorrow.
And maybe I'll come to both of you on this, starting with you, Teara. This feels like an opportunity. There's been so much disruption. There's an opportunity to tear down and rebuild and recenter on things that matter. How do we do that? How do we ensure we don't just snap back to these systems that haven't necessarily been serving us as people and as organizations?
So critically important. This is a gift. Like when everything is kind of broken around us, then, in my language, we have an opportunity to reimagine, rematriate, and rebuild systems that center on equity and sustainability. And that just comes from your great word, disruption. Disrupt. And because in a minute, all these systems will rebuild themselves in the exact same way by the exact same people that built the systems in the first place. It requires huge interventions, meaningful, intentional, deliberate interventions right now to do something differently. And so I say, I'll say it again, reimagine, rematriate, and rebuild systems that center on equity and sustainability for the next 7 generations. And so how do we do that? In every conversation, in every meeting, in every project, and just keep finding the millions of different ways there are to say, who's not in this conversation that should be? How do I step into decolonizing practices today? How will I engage Indigenous sovereignty in the work that I'm doing? And how do I love and honor the wholeness of people, especially those that may be different than me?
Mm-hmm. Brooke, same question to you. Maybe I'll tweak it a little bit. Share with us some of the conversations you're having now with companies about ESG and EDI.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially like ESG, just meaning that there's a heightened awareness that we all have to pitch in to, deal with the world that's falling apart, the environmental issues, but the social and justice issues that Teara had mentioned. So really it comes down to what's of concern and material to the company's wider stakeholder group. So a lot of it is around, I see a trend being more about data because it's got to be more than just, oh, this is what I think we need to fix. It's more understanding, the employee base, the kind of the issues that they're grappling with, and that doesn't always come out to the surface, especially if your systems aren't designed to catch it. So you need to, again, be very intentional in what you're trying to solve for. And a lot of times that's culture. So it's kind of building that underlying culture, not partly in the day-to-day, but in the systems as well. Like, what are you compensating and rewarding your employees for? What sort of things are they spending their time in that they really enjoy? And I think there's a heightened demand. Like, we've got discussions on the Great Resignation. Employees and just the world in general really want to feel like they are making a difference in terms of social justice. And so that's a key differentiating factor in how you're building your culture, how you're creating your structure, how you're being transparent and how you're going about it, and being willing to be humble to say, okay, I realize we've got it wrong, we've got to pivot, and kind of that continuous feedback loop as well. So I think it's at all levels. It's kind of come from the bottom up, and then as well with the commitment sort of from top executives down, and then also kind of 360 in other stakeholders that you're that are important in that mix as well.
And sort of what I'm hearing there, Brooke, it's all good and well to say the things we're supposed to say or have good intentions, but if you don't really understand the problem or the systems that are enabling a certain culture, it's going to be very hard to change. Steps need to be taken.
Yeah, and for example, at PwC, I do think there's a larger focus on our employee network groups, because that's sort of that grassroots discussion on what are the key instances that are important to them, and and the intersectionality of that, because the other thing too is some of those issues are cross-sectional in different employee network groups, and kind of having that listening ear and understanding what some of those issues are. Like, that's actually your best advertisement. Like, if your employees love working for you and you're creating that culture, that actually just leads to better people and better outcomes, and it's just the right place to invest.
I want to talk for a moment about exclusion. And Teara, you mentioned that you've shed the term imposter syndrome. And before we hit record today, we had a conversation about your title and how it's not CEO, it's lead executive. Can you share a little bit about why you've made these changes and why you're maybe consciously excluding certain terms?
So I'm doing my own work around power and privilege, and examining, different segments of privilege and my relationship with those segments, and doing some teaching on that work. I think I'm doing more learning than teaching, but and so before it was, when your email comes up and you just see a little bit of it, and you would just see a bit of my signature, and I would see the word chief, and I'm like, why am I calling myself a chief? It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so my daughter and I had a conversation for a long time about that, connecting that back with the power and privilege work. I'm actually examining almost all the words that I use. Where are those coming from? What do they actually mean? Is there, racist, ableist, white supremacist undertones or origins to those words? And so my good friend Catherine Room wrote an article around her switch to LEO, Lead Executive Officer. So I went with that for a while. I was like, yeah, that's good, Catherine. I'm going to do that also. And then I couldn't figure out why I was calling myself an officer. I'm like, why? What am I an officer of? Like, that's weird. I don't know. And so the point being, how are we just being super aware of ourselves and the world around us? And language really matters. Mm-hmm.
It really does. And not to get too granular here, but I think this is really important. How do you practice mindfulness around this? We use language constantly, and it can be difficult to pause and reflect when we're communicating so frequently on the words that we're using. Do you have a practice? Do you journal? Do you record yourself? What are some steps you're taking?
I make awkward pauses all the time, because I'll say something and then I'll be like, what does that mean actually? And I'll actually have really awkward pauses when I'm talking to people, or even when I'm articulating, or now even when I'm speaking. If I say something and I'm like, oh, hang on, and then I'll just actually make the implicit, whatever's going on inside, explicit, to say, I'm not sure why I'm using those words, but something about that doesn't feel right to me. So give me just a second while I think about another way of saying what I'm truly intending, and just be taking the time to actually do that, and just having it be part of the daily practice, and also noticing the kinds of language other people are using.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, because I think this is very interesting. I'm sure listeners are maybe wondering, oh, how can I start practicing mindfulness around this?
I'll share one other thing. So I've been very specifically working with my relationship with privilege in the ableism segment. And so I've asked people to say, I'm really, for the next 30 days, Jason Ford invites us to do a privilege pledge, where we look at one of the dimensions of privilege for 30 days and examine our relationship and our language with it. And so I've also said to people, I'm really looking at this, and if I say anything that seems like you don't know what it means, or it is problematic, will you let me know? And I've also asked permission of others in a recent project environment to say, I'm working on power and privilege, my relationship with it, very specifically around the language that I'm using. If I notice us using language that is problematic, that we're likely completely unaware of it, is it all right if I bring it into light so that we can notice more often the language that we're using?
Thank you for sharing that. That's a great way to start a conversation. Brooke, what are you seeing in this space? Are you having conversations about conversations?
Yeah, and I should say too, I love that, Teara, because it calls into, like, kind of highlights, the importance of language, and kind of, because you're right, there is a lot of language that you don't think about because it's just used in general conversation, that you're quickly trying to fix in your head, okay, well, I say this when I mean this. And a lot of the colloquialisms and, like pop culture even sayings, and not recognizing sometimes that doesn't mean anything to someone who doesn't come from here as well, and they don't have that context. So calling it into light, and then actually giving permission for others to do the same, I think that's a great practice.
And sorry,
please go ahead.
Just how often we use mental illness as metaphor, how often we use addiction as metaphor, how often we use the ableism as metaphor, how often we say our blind spots, that's crazy, that's insane, all of these ways in which we've just come to express ourselves that are hurtful.
Yeah, and I never noticed it too until someone pointed it out. But warfare as well, like boots on the ground, and kind of the we're gonna kill it. That sort of language also comes from aggression, and through without the lack of love, and so not and not realizing that until it's pointed out. So I think that is really powerful. And so it comes down to, I think, exactly that. Number one, in conversation, I think that's very cultural. And so the more that you see that others are doing that, I think the more you can encourage others to do the same. But also in your policies and sort of the written vernacular, which I think that we've been very careful because we are a larger organization, but sometimes that can seep into like job descriptions and how feedback is written, and I think having that lens as well adds a lot. And for those, when you talk about it, being very intentional on why you're changing the language, I think adds that much more to the conversation.
In the final minutes we have left, I'd like to put this to each of you, something you'll be reflecting on or thinking about in 2022 as we emerge from the pandemic to what will no doubt be a different version of reality. We've had a lot of thought-provoking ideas shared here so far, but anything else you'd like to add? Brooke, I'll start with you because you're unmuted.
Sure. No, that sounds good. I'm really concerned. So right now, a lot of us have been working from home. So, it's a lot of great things in that there's a more level playing field. So I think one thing that I'm really going to be considering in 2022 is how to make sure that we create that equity and inclusion when we become hybrid. So not to exclude those who might be at home more, making sure that those processes, as we're changing the way we're working, really make sure that everyone's included no matter what.
Thank you. And Teara, what are you going to be considering this year?
So with the Square Air, we're very much focused on, just disrupting all those systems, and in particular, disrupting, decolonizing, and decarbonizing our skies for the next 7 generations, because we have to start and keep making our decisions with the next 7 generations in mind, or all of what we're doing is, I would question the meaningfulness of it if we're not actually looking to a sustainable future.
Wonderful. Teara and Brooke, thank you both so much for joining us on our Women in Leadership podcast. It was great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Our guests today were Teara Fraser, the founder and lead executive of Square Air, and Brooke Coe, tax partner and BC Region Inclusion and Diversity Leader for PwC Canada. You've been listening to or watching our Women in Leadership podcast and vodcast series sponsored by PwC. Other episodes are available at biv.com/audio or /video. I'm Haley Wooden, executive editor of Business in Vancouver. Thanks so much for joining us, and make sure to check out the other episodes that form part of our Women in Leadership series.